Number 8. Camp Century. As the looming prospect of nuclear war with the Soviet Union intensified during the 1950s, the United States Army entertained the idea of building a hidden network of missile storage and launch sites beneath the Greenland ice sheet. To determine whether this was feasible, the Army launched a top-secret problem called Project Iceworm. The operation was kept secret even from Denmark, which ruled Greenland at the time. As a cover-up, the US deceived the Danish government into thinking that the military was carrying out a different research project. That project was called Camp Century, with the goal of building affordable ice cap outposts in northwestern Greenland. Engineers dug 21 trenches and nearly 2 miles of tunnels and filled the space with pre-made buildings, including a hospital, theater, shop, church, and housing for the 200 military members who lived at the clandestine base. The project hit a snag when ice core data revealed that the glacier the base was built on was traveling much faster than anyone had initially realized. The tunnels and stations would likely be destroyed within 2 years. For this and other reasons, including Denmark's suspicions about what was really going on at the base, Project Iceworm was cancelled in 1965 and Camp Century was abandoned. The Army assumed that the site would remain frozen in the ice forever and left behind dangerous biological, radioactive, and chemical waste. But as we know today, glaciers are melting at unprecedented rates. A 2016 study concluded that if the waste isn't cleaned up by the year 2100, it'll start leaking into the surrounding environment. In 2019, Danish scientist Nana Carlson told the BBC that the base was still 62 miles from the glacier's edge. The good news is that there's time to clean it up. The bad news is that experts don't know how much time because the ice is melting rapidly. Number 7. The Diefenbunker. In 1959, construction began on a top-secret 4-story underground bunker near Ottawa, Ontario, Canada's capital city. It was meant to house the country's top government and military officials in the event of a nuclear war. Named the Diefenbunker after then Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, it was designed to accommodate a little over 500 occupants for a month while enabling them to continue running the country from underground. The clandestine facility was built on a former farm in a valley located relatively close to downtown Ottawa, making it an ideal place for leaders to retreat on short notice. From start to finish, construction on the 100,000 square foot shelter took less than 18 months. The Diefenbunker operated as a Canadian Forces station from 1961 to 1964. It was manned 24 hours a day by 100 to 150 staff members and facilitated some of Canada's most classified communications at the time. Today, the bunker looks just as it did at the height of the Cold War. It's open to the public, offering visitors a first-hand look at its war room, the Prime Minister's bedroom, sleeping quarters for other officials and staff members, washrooms, offices, machine rooms, the kitchen, the cafeteria, exercise and activity areas, and more. Number 6. Camp X-Ray. Chances are you've heard of the infamous detention camp at the Guantanamo Bay U.S. Naval Station in southeastern Cuba. The military prison at the base opened shortly after the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center towers in 2001. Part of the site, known as Camp X-Ray, has surprisingly different origins. Built during the 1990s, it was meant for housing immigrants who were denied asylum in the U.S. During the mid-90s, more than 100,000 Cuban asylum seekers were approved to move to America. Those who ended up at Camp X-Ray, known as excludables, were sent back to Cuba. After 9/11, Camp X-Ray was repurposed as a temporary detention facility while the military built a longer-term facility nearby. The more permanent prison was meant to be temporary, but Camp X-Ray was meant to be even more temporary. Suspected Taliban and Al-Qaeda soldiers were brought there from Afghanistan and locked in tiny cages measuring roughly 8 square feet. They languished for roughly 3 months before Camp X-Ray was shut down, and the prisoners were moved to the newly built facility known as Camp Delta. As detainees began to file complaints, which included allegations of horrific abuse by guards, the military was court-ordered to preserve any evidence of how prisoners were treated at Guantanamo. Plans to raise Camp X-Ray were therefore halted, and the site was simply left to rot. It wasn't long before the harsh tropical climate began to take its toll, leaving the site overgrown and filled with rotting plywood guard towers and other temporary structures. The prison at Guantanamo was never exactly a secret, but most of what went on there was. was, including inexcusable torture, humiliation, and violence against suspects at the hands of the CIA and the American military. Camp Delta has also been closed down, and nobody is allowed to tour the abandoned property. Number 5. HAARP Research Station. The High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, or HAARP, is in a remote part of Alaska called Gakona. It was established in 1993 as a collaborative effort between the U.S. Army, the U.S. Air Force, and the University of Alaska. It was designed for researching the ionosphere, the region spanning between 50 and 600 miles above the Earth, for potential radio communications and surveillance developments. The HAARP station is equipped with a high-powerful frequency transmitter, a collection of 180 antennas, and other devices that are used for measuring and observing activity in the ionosphere. Two of the facility's biggest goals are to develop VLF, or very low frequencies, and ELF, or extremely low frequencies, for communication with submarines. To some, the dozens of antennas resemble oversized television antennas, and while most people accept the explanation that the station is a research facility, many have jumped on the bandwagon with various conspiracy theories surrounding the site, including the possibilities that the antennas are a weather control device, a mind control device, a space weapon, or a death ray. After all, why would the HAARP facility be located in such a remote area if there wasn't any deep, dark secrets behind it? As it turns out, there's a simple explanation. In order for the equipment to work, it needs to be located in an auroral region. Alaska is the only place in the US that qualifies. The equipment also needs a quiet electromagnetic location, which further explains the location. Officially speaking, the HAARP station is not qualified, but officials have admitted in past interviews that they conduct defensive research there, and it's not exactly open to the public. In 2015, the US Air Force vacated the base due to a lack of funding. It was turned over to the University of Alaska and remains in operation under its new civilian staff. Number 4. Fort Detrick. Shortly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in late 1941, the American government bought a collection of 5 large farms encompassing a 1,200-acre tract of land in Maryland. In 1943, the property known as Fort Detrick became the birthplace of the U.S. Army Biological Warfare Laboratories, where scientists carried out intensive biological warfare research. Run by the Army's Chemical Warfare Service, these experiments were carried out under the same level of secrecy that was afforded to the Manhattan Project, which saw the development of the atomic bomb. Staff members worked with extremely dangerous pathogens, including anthrax. Throughout World War II, 5,000 bombs containing anthrax spores were produced at the site. The first public inklings of the biological weapons research that went on at Fort Detrick came in 1946. These activities nevertheless continued, and the facilities were actually expanded in the early 1950s. During the 1950s, scientists infamously performed disturbing experiments on human subjects as part of Operation Whitecoat. Most of the volunteers were Seventh-day Adventists who were conscientious objectors, meaning they were religiously opposed to fighting in a war. The trials at Fort Detrick were offered to them as an alternative to participating in armed service after regular recruits became suspicious of the experiments and refused to go forward without more information about what was going to be done to them. During that same decade, 2 workers at Fort Detrick died from anthrax exposure, and in 1964, an employee died from viral encephalitis. Later on in the Cold War, researchers at the base shifted their primary focus from offensive biological weapons to infectious disease research. Various types of biological research continue at the site today, and Fort Detrick is no longer a secret. Although parts of it are open to the public, other sections remain off-limits to visitors. At number 3. Winegut 1. As World War II entered its later stages in 1944 and began turning largely in favor of the Allies, the Nazis attempted to build a network of underground bunkers and tunnels in the Upper Bavaria region that could withstand bombing campaigns. The idea came after an intensive, wide-scale Allied attack on Germany's factories and industrial sites. The Third Reich's vision for the covert facility included plans for a partially underground 9-story factory for building jet engines that would remain hidden from view with plants and soil. Known as Weingut 1, construction on the top-secret facility began in 1944 in the remote wilderness outside Munich. By then, the Allies had already seized Germany's airspace, making it nearly impossible to build the site unnoticed. As the Nazis' grip on the war continued to loosen, it became clear that they would never be be able to finish Weingut 1 in time for it to benefit them in any meaningful way, but the Germans continued building in a frenzied attempt to meet the project's ambitious 6-month construction deadline. Most of the work was done by forced laborers. Out of the roughly 10,000 workers at the site, more than 8,500 of them were enslaved prisoners. More than 3,000 laborers were cruelly worked to death, starved to death, or were murdered, or otherwise perished from the brutal treatment they endured at the hands of the Nazis. American forces discovered the project and captured aerial images of it, but they decided not to bomb it, possibly because they may have known that there was a forced labor camp nearby. The Americans were also pretty confident that there was no way Weingut 1 would be finished by the time the Allies defeated Germany, so they saw no reason to destroy it. In fact, the construction may have benefited US forces by keeping German troops distracted from other, more important things. By the time the U.S. Army took over the site in 1945, 7 of the bunker's 12 planned arched sections had been built. 2 years later, in 1947, the military demolished all but one section, which still stands today as a forlorn testament to the atrocities of war. Number 2. Bechevinka. During the 1960s, the Soviet Union established a top-secret submarine base and military town called Bechevinka, located on the Kamchatka Peninsula in the country's far east region. The remote settlement consisted of 8 apartment buildings. There was a kindergarten and school, a hostel, a post office, a grocery store, and a club for entertainment. The military installations consisted of barracks, storage facilities, a commandant's office, a headquarter building, a diesel substation, and a fuel warehouse. There was no overland route to Bechevinka, and it had no airstrip. The only way to get there was by boat or helicopter. The base got almost everything it needed, including food, mail, and equipment from a weekly supply ship. It was Bechevinka's only connection to the outside world. Like many other Soviet military sites, the base closed down shortly after the Soviet Union fell. Residents packed up and relocated, leaving behind a ghost town. Today, Bechevinka remains much like it was left, minus the toll that time and the elements have taken on it. Because of its remoteness and the difficulty of reaching it, the property's remaining structures have spared largely from vandalism and other human-related damage. The ruins consist of rusting ships and derelict buildings filled with personal belongings that people left behind, including toys, newspapers, equipment manuals, textbooks, children's drawings, and furniture. And at number 1, Erickson Air Station. Roughly 1,200 miles southwest of Anchorage, Alaska, in the Bering Sea, there's a tiny island called Shemya. Located on the western tip of the Aleutian Islands archipelago, it measures a little over 2 miles wide and 4 miles long. This far-flung landmass is home to an active U.S. Air Force airport called Erickson Air Station. It opened in 1943 as Shemya Air Force Base after Army Air Force engineers were tasked with building a runway big enough for B-29 Superfortress bombers. They ended up building a 10,000-foot landing strip and 2 5,000-foot cross runways. After the war, the military abandoned the base almost entirely. They left behind an array of aircraft wrecks, decaying buildings, and vehicles that were no longer needed now that the conflict was over. Shemya was put back into use during the Korean War and once again became inactive afterward. Military operations resumed again in 1958, and the airport saw commercial use on and off over the years. During the 1970s, the base became home to a ballistic missile radar system called Cobra Dane. Its main function was to gather intelligence. Shemya was also briefly used as an anti-ballistic missile testing site. In 1994, it was closed as an active Air Force station, but its airport continues to operate as a refueling station and a diversionary airport. Although Shemya technically isn't a secret, not many people know about it, and very few civilians ever see it. At the very least, its desolate and distant location only makes it natural for one to assume that it was meant to be kept hidden from the public. Thanks for watching. Which one of these secret military bases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.